These were two young men, both with a bright future ahead of them. And what happened was absolutely horrific.
The whole 19 years, I tried so hard to raise a good kid. You know, someone like them, they just took seconds to take away from me.
A rancher found a body in a blue blanket by the pond.
Then investigators get another phone call that's eerily similar.
He was also bound with the same brown tape.
I like his energy, he likes my energy.
They wanted to get what they felt like they deserved, some sort of payback.
I was married. I'm a victim.
I told her, are you ready?
They were not going to stop.
You're like a Bonnie Tyler.
San Antonio, Texas. Just after dawn on June 18, 2014, a 911 call comes into the Bexar County Sheriff's Office.
A rancher found a body in his ranch, laying in a blue blanket by the pond.
It's secluded ranch land out in southeast Bexar County near Bronig Lake.
Deputies respond to the call.
They come out there, this young man has been shot in the back of the head.
When the medical examiner arrived, he noticed once the blanket had been removed that this male had been bound. His hands and his legs had been tied.
The individual was restrained with brown duct tape.
The body had not been there for a long time.
The medical examiner makes another startling discovery.
He had been shot 3 times, once in the back of the head, once in the chest, and once in the face.
The victim is a young male, but that's as much as investigators can tell.
The individual had no ID, no cell phone, no wallet.
They're not sure whether this body was dumped here, if he was shot on site.
As investigators scour the area, they find a clue.
What they did notice is that there was blood found away from the body, which suggested to them that this individual had been shot and may have tried to flee from his attackers.
They're going to start closest to the body and comb their way out, looking for anything that is out of place. And what they end up finding is this trunk liner. They find a car jack, and both have blood splatter all over them.
So the question now is, what happened at this scene? Was the person shot and killed in the car and then dumped? Was there an escape attempt that took place?
Every crime scene tells a story. And in this particular case, what we observed from the crime scene was an individual who was bound with duct tape and had been shot. And it appeared as though this person had been abducted, tied up, driven out to this remote location, and executed. It was something that was frankly quite disturbing.
Based on the evidence that's there, the condition of the body, where the body is located, it's clear that this was nothing but a cold-blooded killing. There was no other circumstance that could have led to it accidentally. This was the intention.
Detectives speak with the rancher and his wife. She tells them she woke up to the sound of her dogs barking around 4:30 a.m.
She looks out the window and sees some headlights. She's not sure what to make of that, doesn't want to go outside, so she goes back to sleep.
However, during the morning time, she nudged her husband, was like, hey, I need you to go check to make sure our cows was not stolen. Unfortunately, what he did identify was that there was a deceased body laying in a blanket, which prompted him to immediately call 911.
Investigators wrap up at the crime scene, leaving the ranch with few answers.
Investigators are trying to identify who this victim is. There's no identification. There's no other identifying information that they can locate on or near their body. And so what they have available to them at that point is to take fingerprints and hopefully come up with an ID from there. Because until they can identify who this victim is, there's really not a lot that they can do from an investigative standpoint.
24 hours go by without any indication of who this person might be. That's when they get the missing persons report.
A missing persons report came in for 20-year-old Xavier Cordero because he had failed to show up for work. His physical description was an exact match to the male victim who had been found on the ranch.
When the medical examiner compared the fingerprints, they were able to make a positive identification for Xavier.
Through the report, investigators learned that Xavier Cordero was born and raised in San Antonio.
Xavier Cordero came from an amazing family. He had a very kind mother and kind father. These were loving parents. He was a productive member of society. He had no criminal history. He had stable employment.
Xavier was very close to his family, and he actually was living with his grandmother at the time while he was working at a clothing store.
Xavier Cordero was well-loved. He had a girlfriend for the past 3 months. They'd met on Facebook. No one had a bad word to say about Xavier.
After identifying Xavier's body, investigators must break the news to his family.
When investigators speak to Xavier's family, they learn that he was on the family's shared phone plan, which is a huge break in the case.
The family immediately provided them with detailed call records of his most recent communication on the spot.
Ordinarily, when law enforcement is investigating a case, cell phone data and call log data is something that can be tremendously helpful. Under normal circumstances, law enforcement might have to get a warrant to obtain cell phone records, but in this particular case, because Xavier Cordero was on his cell phone plan, his parents were able to provide law enforcement with his call logs, and they learned that the last call made was at 2:23 in the morning on June 18th.
Detectives learned something else from Xavier's loved ones.
Xavier Cordero drove a black Mitsubishi Lancer,
A car no one in his family has seen since Xavier went missing.
One of the questions that law enforcement had was, where is Xavier Cordero's vehicle?
Next, detectives visit the clothing store where Xavier worked.
And what they found was that Xavier was a very kind, very gracious individual. Xavier was one of the employees that was always punctual and always on time. This was very shocking for them to find out that what happened to him.
Xavier had a great work ethic. He was someone who was punctual to work, showed up and did a good job. And that day when he didn't show up, his coworkers knew that something was wrong. He wasn't responding to phone calls, he wasn't responding to text messages, and this was a major red flag.
They report what has become a common theme in the investigation.
He was not the kind of person who had any enemies. There was no one out there that had any animosity toward him. There was no reason something like this should have happened to something like Xavier Cordero.
Investigators doubled down on their efforts.
Xavier drove a black Mitsubishi Lancer, but they didn't know where his car was.
They issue an alert on the vehicle to local law enforcement.
Locating that vehicle, though, had to be priority one, because finding that vehicle might provide law enforcement with important forensic evidence that could help them solve the crime, including blood evidence, DNA evidence, or fingerprint evidence.
But finding it could be nearly impossible.
Locating Xavier Cordero's vehicle was incredibly important for law enforcement, but in a metropolitan area like San Antonio and Bexar County, it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
The day after the body of 20-year-old Xavier Cordero was found on a rural Texas ranch, San Antonio investigators look for his missing Mitsubishi Lancer. They also continue to reach out to those closest to Xavier. His girlfriend, 18-year-old Brittany, agrees to an interview.
Xavier Cordero had been dating his girlfriend for about 3 months at the time of his disappearance and murder. They met on Facebook, they had a good relationship, and his girlfriend seemed genuinely concerned about what had happened to him.
So Brittany is able to tell the investigators that Xavier had actually been spending most nights with her at her apartment.
The night he went missing, he left her place around 2:30 a.m.
She told them that he didn't really provide her with a clear answer about where he was going when he left that evening. She walked him to his car, and they made plans to go to the mall the next day around lunchtime.
Brittany says Xavier left in his prized Mitsubishi Lancer.
But she says she never heard from him again.
When hours passed and no sign of Xavier, Brittany started getting concerned. She started calling his phone, calling his friends. No answer. No one knew where he was. She even went to his grandma's house.
After her several attempts of trying to identify where Xavier was, she then decided to use social media to reach out to individuals to see if they knew where Xavier was, and she ended up messaging an individual by the name of D.
Brittany said that Xavier and Dee had kind of a strained on-again, off-again relationship. She says, "Do you know where Xavier is?" Dee told her that Xavier was in jail. She knew that wasn't true.
His girlfriend didn't really find credible because he was not the type of person to get into trouble with the law. And that certainly was something that made her suspicious.
Brittany doesn't know Dee's address, but agrees to show them where he lives.
Once deputies were able to make contact with D and asked him about the statement he made to Brittany that Xavier was in jail, he admitted to the deputies that he had made that story up.
That it was all just a joke, that he was essentially pranking Brittany, that he didn't know what had happened to Xavier, that at that point he didn't even know that Xavier was deceased.
They got a DNA swab. They met with him, they searched his apartment, and ultimately, Dee was fully cooperative and eliminated as a suspect.
Brittany is also ruled out.
Xavier's girlfriend was genuinely concerned about his well-being, whereabouts, and wanting to know what had happened to him. She was fully cooperative with law enforcement and was doing everything within her power to help them find answers to their questions.
With still no sign of Xavier's car and no suspects, investigators turn back to the one piece of evidence they have left.
When investigators hit a dead end for the leads that they currently had, what they decided to do was they decided to go back to the phone records and dial the last number that Xavier called at 2:23 a.m. And to their surprise, a female answered the phone.
They're able to make contact with 19-year-old Antoinette Martinez. She tells them she's Xavier's ex-girlfriend. She's currently babysitting, kind of busy right now, but she would be willing to go down and speak with them at a later time.
The next day, Antoinette sits down with investigators at the Bexar County Sheriff's Office. She says she and Xavier broke up about 3 months ago, but stayed in touch.
She admitted that from time to time, even though they were broken up, they would still spend time together.
She indicated that she had an on-again, off-again relationship with Xavier Cordero. They weren't necessarily dating. It was just kind of a casual, romantic relationship, if you will. And she told law enforcement the last time she had seen him was the night before his disappearance.
She claims that Xavier reached out to her on June 17th asking if he could come over. She said yes, but he never showed. She didn't find that too odd, said that had happened in the past, kind of flaky in that regard.
Before they release her, investigators have one final question.
Detectives asked Antoinette point blank, did she have anything to do with Xavier's murder? And she was adamant she had absolutely nothing to do with his killing.
Based on law enforcement's initial contact with Antoinette, the information she provided to them didn't really raise any red flags, so they didn't really consider her a suspect.
The interview is another dead end. Then, investigators get word of a new development.
A patrol officer spotted Xavier's 2010 Mitsubishi Lancer located by a dumpster.
Police transported Xavier's vehicle to a lot to be tested for forensics. They checked for fingerprints, they checked for DNA, and they checked for blood, and ultimately they were able to obtain some hits that helped them further the investigation.
They find blood inside the trunk and fingerprints on the door handle of the driver's side of the Lancer.
Law enforcement observed that the trunk liner to the car was missing. This was consistent with the trunk liner that was found by Xavier's body and led them to believe that Xavier had been tied up, put in the trunk of his own vehicle, driven to the pasture, and executed.
Investigators clearly have a very heinous crime on their hands. However, at this point, they don't have any firm leads or evidence that will lead them to who could have done this.
For 10 days, the investigation stalls until another gruesome discovery puts all of Bexar County on high alert.
June 30th, Bexar County investigators get another phone call that's eerily similar. Another young Hispanic man found shot to death in a rural area.
"12 days after Xavier Cordero was found shot to death on a rural Texas ranch, investigators get word of another killing.
An individual was visiting from New York and was looking at property in the greater San Antonio area. While reviewing property, and this was rural land, he was kind of in a cornfield type area, and he noticed a distinct odor, something very foul. When he walked towards that odor, he observed a partially decomposed body.
Just like Xavier, this young man had been shot in the back of the head.
He was also bound the same way with his hands and legs with the same brown tape that appeared to be a part of Xavier's murder.
So at this point, investigators have two individuals that have been murdered. Both young men, both Hispanic males, both bound, both shot. So it seems like these two incidents are connected. It seems like there's an MO here. It seems like there's a pattern of behavior that exists between these two incidents that would lead investigators to think that the same people may be responsible.
Investigators aren't sure if they have a serial killer on their hands, so they alert surrounding counties.
Detectives get a call from the San Antonio Police Department about a missing persons case.
Stephen Rendon had been reported to the San Antonio Police Department as a missing person. When they located the remains by the cornfield, the individual there was wearing clothes consistent with those last seen being worn by Stephen Rendon. Later, the medical examiner in the autopsy was able to confirm that the person found by the cornfield was in fact the same Stephen Rendon that had been reported missing.
19-year-old Stephen's mother, Kathy Chavez, filed the report 3 days earlier. Detectives break the news to her.
I just thought, that maybe they're gonna call, just talk to me a little bit more and stuff like that. I didn't even think anything more than that. So when they came in, they introduced themselves and everything, and they kind of told me just a little bit, just like, that they had found, someone out there. It was Stephen that we found.
Stephen's mom had no idea who would want to hurt her son.
He was like an old soul, he didn't go out or anything like that, parties and stuff like that, that some of the kids will have parties or whatever. He never did want to go. He would stay home a lot. He does not do things like that. So when a mom says she knows her son, she knows her son. Stephen was a really good kid. I was blessed to have a kid just like him. And I was glad that I told him, that I don't know what I did in my life, that I had, someone like you, because he made parenting very easy. When he was going into the 6th grade, I just told him that, you're going to be in band, so I just wanted to keep him busy, and he just like, okay, and it was a good choice, because he loved it.
He was a goofball. I met him when he was a 6th grader, I was a 7th grader. And when we first ran into each other in band, we were both in percussion. From there, everything just was history. Once we progressed to high school, that's when everything just started getting ramped up. And it was just constantly being fun. Just being around him.
At Harlandale High School, Stephen was in the elite drum line.
Snare drum. That was his thing, and he was really good at it because he could read the music. So I was a band parent, you know. Went to all the competitions, went, you know, all the football games. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He was into cars.
After high school, Stephen attended night school to become a mechanic.
He wanted to have a shop. He wanted to be that person to where he doesn't charge a lot. Because you know how mechanics, they tend to try to get you for everything that's wrong with your car.
Kathy gives investigators a rundown of the last time she saw her son.
She informed them that Stephen on June the 25th had left the home around 11 p.m. And when she asked where he was going, he stated to her that he was going to return something to a friend.
I could hear that he was on the phone. And that's when he, you know, just kind of came and asked me, you know, if it was okay if he would go and drop off something to a friend of his. I said, it's kind of late. I said, you know, do you think you can go some other time or something? And he just looked at me like, you know. And I was like, well, just go and do, but you come right back home. And he said, okay.
About 3 hours later, Stephen's mom got a text from Stephen saying he was running late. Her instincts told her something wasn't right, and she turned out to be correct because Stephen never came home.
I could still see him standing there, you know, and I can see everything. He just still looks clear, you know. And not knowing that was going to be the last time I was going to see him.
As investigators speak with the mother of murder victim Stephen Rendon, they learn about another potential connection between Stephen and Xavier Cordero.
Both of these young men happen to drive a Mitsubishi Lancer.
Kathy says the orange car was Stephen's pride and joy.
He saw that car in the parking lot, and he comes home and he goes, Mom, there's this car that I saw. He goes, I really like it. He goes, it's really nice. And before you know it, he was coming home with it.
His 2010 orange Mitsubishi Lancer was completely tricked out, so it was very expensive. So she wondered if somebody might have been trying to rob him because of his car. So investigators now have issued a be on the lookout for this 2010 orange Mitsubishi Lancer.
That same day, a tip comes into the San Antonio Police Department.
A key development occurred in this case when a young woman came forward and contacted the police.
Now, what she stated to investigators was that her friend, who was dating an individual by the name of Cameo Kleins, had robbed a store the day before. And when she was having a conversation with her friend, she also stated her friend bragged about him killing 2 individuals.
The tipster said she wasn't sure whether or not to believe her friend, but she did know that Stephen Rendon's orange Mitsubishi Lancer was parked outside the apartment that Cameo shared with her friend.
She gives investigators her friend's name, and it's one they've heard before.
Antoinette Martinez was 19 years old and Xavier Cordero's ex-girlfriend.
San Antonio police confirm that Cameo Kleins was involved in an armed robbery at a convenience store.
Cameo did commit a robbery the day before and fled on foot. And during their pursuit, they stated that Cameo took refuge in an apartment that they later identified was being rented by Antoinette Martinez.
In fact, Antoinette aided in his apprehension.
Police get a hold of Antoinette, and she convinces Cameo to surrender peacefully. He walks outside and is arrested for that aggravated robbery.
Investigators head to Antoinette's apartment.
Bexar County investigators was able to secure a search warrant And when they arrived to the location, they identified and located the 2010 orange Mitsubishi Lancer in the parking lot.
Antoinette agrees to go to the station for questioning as police conduct the search.
When they do these search warrants, they look everywhere. They don't leave any stone unturned. They actually find IDs in the tank of the toilet in the restroom submerged in the water.
Investigators find a treasure trove of evidence. They also find a .25 caliber handgun, the same caliber found at the crime scenes of both shootings.
One of the important things they found when they ultimately searched Antoinette Martinez's apartment was a roll of brown duct tape. The reason this was significant is it was consistent with the same type of tape that had been used to tie up and bind Stephen Rendon and Xavier Cordero.
Investigators finally have evidence. They head back to the station to interview Antoinette.
You don't want a Coke?
No, I don't do soda.
You don't? Don't like it? Me either.
Antoinette explains that she's always been a hard worker.
Antoinette had been on her own for quite a while. Her mother died when she was at a young age, but she persevered. She'd become a manager at the Burger King where she worked.
Became shift manager, and I was going to become assistant GM.
She had been trying to save money for college. She'd been trying to work her way up the ladder at her job. She was trying to make a good life for herself.
At the restaurant, she met 19-year-old Cameo Kleins.
We just like, I like his energy, he likes my energy. We were just like, oh, you're cool.
They bonded over simmering frustration with their jobs.
9 days straight, I will open and close, open and close, open and close. No days off, no breaks. Like, to the point where my feet were bleeding yesterday.
She said she worked long hours, often worked overtime, and she felt she was not being properly compensated.
They had bonded over their sheer hatred for their boss, and they often felt that they were underappreciated, underpaid.
Frustrated, Antoinette and Cameo came up with a plan to get both revenge and cash.
Antoinette Martinez and Cameo Kleins, while they were working together at a Burger King, created a false robbery. They contacted police and reported that the Burger King had been robbed, when in fact, they were the two that stole the money.
It was payback for the way she'd been treated.
Antoinette Martinez was open with law enforcement about the Burger King robbery that she had fabricated. However, she tried to distance herself from Xavier Cordero's murder and continued to claim that he had made plans to come over to her apartment that evening, but never arrived.
What do you know about what happened to Xavier?
He never showed up to my apartment.
Don't lie to me, Antoinette. You know, I got a lot of information on you.
And when they present the two IDs to her, she starts singing like a canary.
When investigators confront Antoinette Martinez with an ID from a murder victim found inside her apartment, the 19-year-old starts to talk.
Although she got money from the Burger King robbery, it wasn't enough. She needed more money, she had bills to pay, she had to pay her rent.
That's when Antoinette made the decision to zero in on her ex-boyfriend, Xavier. She knew about this Mitsubishi Lancer that he had, and so she assumed that he had money, and she needed money. And so she hatched a plan to try to lure him to her apartment with the promise of, potentially getting back together.
When Xavier arrived at Antoinette's apartment, he was completely unaware that Cameo Kleins was laying in wait, hiding with a firearm.
Cameo came out with the gun.
Cameo hits Xavier over the head with the gun, and then they bind his hands and legs with the tape.
They put him in the trunk of the car and drove him out to the ranch.
They opened up the trunk and Xavier Cordero tried to run. He was trying to run for his life.
That is when Cameo decided that he was going to shoot him.
I heard a gunshot, and then I think he dead. He was in the bedroom. I think he was still breathing, and he went back to go make sure. Shot him again. Camera shot on me. 2 times.
How much money did he have?
I know it's more than 125 and less than 250.
Xavier didn't have the big money that they thought he had. And so now they decide that they need to plan another crime and find another victim.
Like a Bonnie Clyde, we were just
Click together.
yeah.
Like Bonnie and Clyde.
She planned for them to continue robbing and murdering people. This led ultimately to the abduction, robbery, and murder of Stephen Rendon.
Your intention was to do this fake profile to do what?
Get another victim. They found the victim.
You told Cameo you found the victim.
Yeah.
As with Xavier, Antoinette lured him to her apartment where he was ambushed.
With a gun, pointing it at him, they bound him, placed him in the back of the trunk, drove him to a rural area, and that's when he was also murdered.
You must rob him.
Robbed him?
Yeah.
You shot him?
Yeah.
You put him in the bed?
She never shed a tear. She never expressed any real remorse. She never showed any emotion. And all of this was deeply unsettling.
After Stephen's murder, Antoinette and Cameo discovered once again they didn't get much money.
Stephen only had $5 on him and a cell phone.
They did take his cell phone to a mall kiosk and sell it for $170. So all told, from this killing, they got $175.
They wanted to go out and commit these robberies as payback to get what they felt that they deserved.
Antoinette is clear about one thing. It was Cameo who pulled the trigger, not her.
Cameo, unlike Antoinette, is not talking. He's not giving up anything. And so investigators have to come up with a different plan.
One of the tactics investigators use when one individual don't want to talk is they put both individuals in a room together and listen in on the conversation on a hidden mirror to see if these individuals are actually going to talk.
At first, the pair makes light of their trouble.
I'm going down for autograph. You're going down with 2 got and murder. Nigga, I'll write you in 15 years, dude. I'm serious, I ain't going down.
But the tone changes.
I had 2 jobs in my own apartment and working on my driving license. I go back to school.
I haven't cried about any of it. You know, it's hitting me.
Antoinette leaves the room. Investigators take another crack at Cameo.
Cameo Kleins was also interviewed by law enforcement, but his interview was very different than that of Antoinette Martinez. He was emotional, he was crying, he was distraught in that interview.
I'm just sorry, man. I'm sorry.
He began to crack. He told law enforcement that this was all Antoinette's idea. I did what she wanted to do.
Antoinette wanted him dead. I told her I ain't gonna kill him. I told her we could rob him. I ain't gonna kill him. I don't kill him. I'm so easy to be persuaded. It ain't even fun.
So she persuaded you to do this?
Yes, sir.
He says Antoinette could be very persuasive. He just got mixed up in her evil plot.
For Antoinette, this all seemed to be some sort of payback. She was out to get what she felt she was due.
She was the mastermind behind this entire tragedy. Antoinette Martinez was the one pulling the strings.
And, according to Cameo, she also pulled the trigger.
So who's the one that shoots him?
Under suspicion for 2 murders, Cameo Kleins explains to investigators how he and Antoinette Martinez fired the shots that killed Stephen Randone.
And are you both holding the gun like just like this? Okay. Ready? Yes. I can hear it slowly in his body. Really? Okay.
Cameo says it was the same for Xavier's death.
Both our hands are on the trigger.
Antoinette and Cameo are each charged with 2 counts of capital murder.
To be indicted for capital murder means that there has to be some aggravating offense. And in this particular incident, the aggravated robbery was that offense that allowed it to be bumped up to capital murder. That bump up also comes with enhanced and increased potential consequences. So that capital murder offense could come with penalties as high as the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole.
In January 2016, on the eve of his trial, Cameo strikes a deal with prosecutors.
Cameo agrees to a plea deal. In return, he receives 2 concurrent life sentences, and he has the possibility of parole. He will be eligible for parole in 2044.
On the other hand, Antoinette decides that she's going to proceed with trial and she's not going to take a plea. And her case went to trial in September of 2017.
Prosecutors describe Antoinette as a calculating, cold-blooded killer, the mastermind of these crimes, who romanticized them, as referenced by calling herself and Cameo Bonnie and Clyde.
Antoinette Martinez was in control of this entire situation. She decided who was going to be robbed, where they were going to be robbed, and what was going to happen to them. This was about money for her. It was about payback for what she felt like was due to her. And as a result of her mindset, she fabricated the Burger King robbery, went on to rob and murder Xavier Cordero, went on to rob and murder Stephen Randone, and who knows how much further she would have been willing to go.
It was her that was coming out with the ideas. She was the one who manipulated him into doing the stuff that she wanted to do. I knew she was the one that decided on all of this, even though, she said that, she was the victim.
Antoinette's attorneys used the defense that Antoinette is not a murderer. She was just caught up in a toxic relationship with a man that was out here committing crimes.
The defense in this case argued that Antoinette was under the spell or influence of Cameo Kleins, that because of their relationship, he was the one controlling her and telling her what to do. This was a very toxic relationship. Unfortunately for Antoinette Martinez, though, it didn't excuse her behavior. She was responsible for her own decisions and what she did to Stephen Randone and Xavier Cordero.
For a minute there, I thought that she was gonna kind of get away with it. And I kept telling the prosecutors, I said, you need to show everybody what she is.
The jury sees through her defense.
Antoinette is found guilty of 2 counts of capital murder, where she is sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
Xavier Cordero and Stephen Randone were completely innocent individuals. These were 2 young men, both with a bright future ahead of them. And what happened to them was absolutely horrific. It's something unfathomable to be tied up, put in the trunk of your own car, and driven out to a rural area. The entire time, they were both probably hoping, praying that they would just be let go. And unfortunately for them, they were shot and killed in the most calloused of ways.
And it's devastating to think about the fact that so many people's lives are forever changed, and even a couple of young men's lives are lost as a result of this incident.
It didn't have to happen. It all could have been avoided had they just looked the other way. Yeah, I feel bad. I feel bad for his mom because that was her only son. I can't imagine and like how she's feeling.
I just couldn't believe that the whole 19 years that I tried so hard to raise a good kid, someone like them, they just took seconds to take away from me. It's not the reason why I brought him here,
The night in Alberta had the kind of silence that feels almost unnatural, as if the world itself is holding its breath. In a small town where nothing ever seemed to happen, where porch lights blinked on at the same time every evening, and neighbors waved without needing to speak, no one could have imagined that behind one of those ordinary windows, something irreversible was already in motion. Inside the Richardson household, there was no sign of chaos yet, no shattered glass, no raised voices that would have alerted the neighbors, just the quiet rhythm of a family trying, in their own imperfect way, to hold on to stability. But beneath that surface, invisible tensions have been building for months, maybe longer. The kind of tensions that do not explode all at once, but rather accumulate in silence until silence itself becomes dangerous. Jasmine Richardson was only 12 years old, an age where the world is supposed to still feel soft around the edges. At school, she was still considered a child. At home, she was still expected to follow rules that she increasingly interpreted not as protection, but as confinement. The difference between those two perceptions would become one of the most important fractures in the story that was about to unfold. Her parents, Mark and Deborah Richardson, were not strangers to discipline. They believed in structure, in boundaries, in the idea that a young girl needed guidance rather than freedom to drift. To them, their rules were not punishment but protection. They were trying to raise a daughter in a world they understood to be unpredictable and sometimes harsh. But what they saw as care, Jasmine experienced as pressure, and that emotional gap widened with every argument, every restriction, every moment she felt misunderstood. In psychology, this stage of early adolescence is often described as a collision between identity formation and external authority. A young mind begins to ask questions it cannot yet fully answer. Who am I without my parents? What happens if I reject their rules? Where does my voice begin when theirs ends? For Jasmine, these questions did not remain abstract. They became emotional pressure points, constantly pressed by frustration and longing for something she could not yet clearly define as independence. It was during this vulnerable period that Jeremy Steinke entered her life. Jeremy was 23 years old, a full adult living in a completely different psychological universe from Jasmine. He was not a neighbor, not a family friend, not someone who naturally belonged in the orbit of a 12-year-old girl. He existed on the edges of society, presenting himself through a carefully constructed persona that combined rebellion, darkness, and a deliberate rejection of conventional stability. His appearance reflected that identity. Gothic clothing, an aura of detachment, and a way of speaking that suggested he was always slightly outside the rules everyone else was expected to follow. To outsiders, Jeremy often seemed like someone performing a role rather than living a life. He was not simply existing. He was trying to be seen in a very specific way. Beneath that performance was a deeper pattern that investigators would later analyze in detail. A need for control, validation, and a sense of importance that he could not achieve through normal social structures. When Jasmine met Jeremy, the imbalance between them was immediate, even if it was not fully recognized at first. He was older, experienced, and capable of shaping narratives. She was still forming her sense of self, still learning how to distinguish between influence and choice. In such dynamics, influence does not arrive as force. It arrives as interpretation, as suggestion, as emotional framing. What begins as attention can slowly become dependence. What begins as understanding can gradually become isolation. And what begins as affection can, under the wrong conditions, evolve into something far more destructive. The Richardson family began to notice changes in Jasmine. At first, they were subtle, a shift in tone, a reluctance to engage in conversation, a growing resistance to rules that had previously been accepted without question. Then came the emotional distance. Arguments became more frequent, not necessarily louder, but more charged, as if every disagreement carried weight far beyond the surface topic. For parents, this kind of change often triggers confusion rather than immediate alarm. Adolescence is expected to bring mood swings, identity exploration, and occasional rebellion. But in this case, something felt different. There was an external presence shaping the internal conflict, a presence that the family could not fully see, but increasingly felt in the atmosphere of their home. They learned about Jeremy Steinke, and with that knowledge came concern that quickly hardened into opposition. From their perspective, the situation was clear. A grown man was involved with their young daughter. From Jasmine's perspective, however, the situation was not framed in the same way. What her parents saw as danger, she experienced as connection. What they saw as manipulation, she interpreted as understanding. This divergence in perception created one of the most fragile and dangerous psychological environments possible within a household. Two realities coexisting without agreement on what was real. The more the parents attempted to restrict contact, the more Jasmine felt controlled. The more controlled she felt, the more she gravitated toward the space where she felt heard. And the more she gravitated outward, the more her parents tightened their boundaries. It was a feedback loop, tightening slowly, almost invisibly, like a rope being wound around a structure that no one realizes is already cracking. Jeremy's role in this dynamic, as later analysis would suggest, was not passive. He did not simply exist as a distant influence. He actively reinforced the emotional narrative that positioned the family as an opposing force. In private communication, he framed restriction as oppression, disagreement as hostility, and parental concern as something closer control than care. These interpretations, repeated over time, can reshape the emotional map of a young mind, especially one already searching for identity outside the home. What makes such situations so difficult to recognize in real time is that nothing appears overtly catastrophic. There is no single moment where everything breaks. Instead, there are conversations that shift tone slightly, decisions that feel slightly more urgent, emotional reactions that become slightly more intense. The danger is not in one event, but in accumulation. By early 2006, the relationship between Jasmine and Jeremy had moved beyond what her family could realistically manage through ordinary restrictions. It existed in private spaces, in messages, in emotional exchanges that did not require physical presence to maintain influence. And within that invisible space, plans began to form. Not sudden plans, not impulsive decisions, but gradual constructions built through repeated reinforcement, emotional escalation, and a shared narrative that increasingly distanced itself from reality. The Richardson household, meanwhile, continued its daily routines, unaware that the center of gravity inside the family was shifting in ways that would eventually make those routines irrelevant. Outside, life in Alberta continued as it always had. Neighbors went to work. Children attended school. The streets remained quiet in the way small towns often are, where safety is assumed rather than questioned. But inside the Richardson home, something was approaching a point of no return, though no one could yet define where that point lay. On the surface, it would still have appeared like a family dealing with teenage conflict. Behind that surface, however, the emotional structure had already begun to collapse into something far more unstable. The boundaries between influence and decision, between affection and control, between childhood and adulthood, were becoming increasingly blurred. And in that blur, a tragedy was beginning to take shape, not as a single act of violence, but as a final outcome of a long and invisible psychological descent. The winter light over Alberta had a way of stretching itself thin, as if even the sun was reluctant to stay too long in a place where everything felt so still. In the Richardson household, that stillness was beginning to change shape. It was no longer the calm rhythm of ordinary family life, but something heavier, more strained, like air before a storm that refuses to break. Jasmine Richardson was 12 years old, standing at that fragile threshold where childhood begins to loosen its grip, but adulthood has not yet arrived to take its place. To outsiders, she still looked like a child. A school uniform, a backpack, a voice that still carried traces of softness. But inside the home, something had shifted in ways her parents could not fully understand. Conversations that used to flow easily now ended in silence or defiance. Doors were closed more often than they were opened. And behind those doors, a new world was forming, one that did not include her family in the way it once had. Her parents noticed it first in small details, the way she hesitated before answering simple questions, the way her attention drifted, as if part of her mind was always somewhere else, the way she became protective of her phone, of her privacy, of anything that might connect her back to a life her parents were still trying to guide. At first, they thought it was ordinary adolescence, a phase, a struggle for independence that would eventually pass with time and boundaries. But the truth was more complicated, because Jasmine was not only pushing away from her parents, she was being pulled towards something else. Jeremy Steinke entered her life like a shadow that did not announce itself. He was older, already shaped by years that had taken him through unstable relationships, fractured identity, and a constant need to redefine himself in ways that never seemed to last. At 23, he carried himself with a kind of deliberate darkness, not necessarily hidden but performed. His clothing, his posture, even the way he spoke, all seemed designed to communicate an image of someone who existed outside normal expectations. To Jasmine, that difference felt like gravity. Where her world felt increasingly controlled, Jeremy represented the opposite: freedom, rebellion, escape. He spoke to her in ways that made her feel older than she was, not by offering wisdom, but by dissolving boundaries. He did not talk to her like a child, and that alone created a powerful shift in how she understood herself. In his presence, she was not a daughter under supervision. She was someone seen differently, someone chosen, someone understood. That feeling, however, carried a cost she could not yet recognize. As their relationship developed, it became more insulated. Conversations moved away from public spaces and into private channels, hidden messages, late-night exchanges, small windows of communication that existed outside the awareness of her family. In those spaces, reality began to bend. Jeremy did not simply listen to her frustrations. He shaped them. He reinforced them. He gave them structure, direction, and eventually purpose. The home she lived in with her parents began to appear differently through that lens. Rules became restrictions. Concern became control. Love became surveillance. Every boundary her parents tried to enforce was reframed as opposition, not protection. And slowly, without any single moment that could be identified as a turning point, the emotional geography of Jasmine's life began to split into two opposing sides. Inside the house, there were parents trying to hold on to their daughter. Outside of it, there was a relationship telling her she needed to break free from them. And between those two forces, Jasmine was being pulled further away from the version of herself that once belonged fully to her family. Jeremy's influence was not always direct or forceful. It often came in fragments. A suggestion, a comment, a shared frustration that felt harmless in isolation but accumulated weight over time. He would describe situations in ways that stripped away complexity, reducing people into roles, those who allowed freedom and those who prevented it. In that simplified world, conflict was not something to be managed. It was something to be resolved. And resolution, in the distorted logic forming between them, began to take on a darker meaning. The Richardson household became a space of increasing tension. Her parents attempted to intervene in ways they believed were responsible. Conversations about boundaries became more frequent. Access to communication was restricted. Attempts were made to separate Jasmine from influences they did not fully trust. But each action, instead of restoring balance, seemed to intensify the emotional distance. To Jasmine, these interventions did not feel like protection. They felt like confirmation. Confirmation that her relationship with Jeremy was being treated as a threat. Confirmation that her independence was being denied. Confirmation that her parents were not simply concerned, but actively opposed to what she was beginning to believe was her own path. This is where the psychological dynamic becomes crucial. In adolescent development, identity formation is not a passive process. It is built through contrast, through separation, through the gradual creation of a self that is distinct from parental authority. When that process becomes entangled with an external figure who reinforces opposition, the separation can intensify beyond healthy boundaries. Jeremy understood this dynamic in a way that may not have been academically articulated, but was behaviorally evident. He positioned himself not just as a romantic partner, but as an alternative authority, someone who validated her feelings in ways her parents no longer could, someone who translated her frustrations into a narrative that made sense of her emotional conflict. And over time, that narrative began to dominate. Inside Jasmine's mind, the idea of home shifted from safety to restriction. The idea of family shifted from belonging to opposition. And the idea of escape, once abstract, began to feel increasingly concrete, as if it were no longer a question of whether to leave emotionally, but how far that separation would need to go. Meanwhile, Jeremy's own psychology added another layer to the unfolding situation. He was not simply a passive influence. He was someone who derived meaning from control and narrative construction. He saw himself as a central figure in a story that was being written in real time. In his interactions with Jasmine, there was an increasing tendency to frame situations as dramatic arcs, where obstacles were not to be negotiated but removed. This is one of the most disturbing elements in later analyses of the case. The blending of adolescent emotional volatility with adult psychological manipulation created a feedback loop. Jasmine's frustrations were amplified by Jeremy. Jeremy's interpretations were validated by Jasmine. Each reinforced the other until the original context, the family structure itself, became redefined as something that needed to be confronted rather than understood. Inside the Richardson home, the atmosphere continued to deteriorate without any obvious external collapse. There were no public incidents at first, no visible breaking point that would alert neighbors or authorities to the severity of what was forming beneath the surface. From the outside, it still resembled a normal household experiencing teenage rebellion. But inside, the emotional separation had already begun to harden. Jasmine's interactions with her parents became shorter, sharper, more defensive. Questions were interpreted as accusations. Requests were interpreted as control. Silence became a form of resistance. And in response, her parents tightened restrictions further, believing they were addressing a behavioral problem, when in reality they were encountering an emotional structure that had already shifted away from them. This mutual escalation created a closed system. The more her parents attempted to intervene, the more Jasmine felt justified in resisting. The more she resisted, the more her parents felt compelled to intervene. And at the center of that cycle, Jeremy's influence continued to reinforce the idea that the conflict was not temporary, but fundamental. At this stage, the tragedy was not yet visible in action, but it was fully formed in trajectory. Every major element was already in place: emotional isolation, external influence, generational conflict, perceived loss of autonomy, and a relationship dynamic that reinforced escalation rather than resolution. What remained was not the question of whether something would happen, but when the fragile balance between perception and reality would finally collapse under the weight of its own construction. Before anything went wrong, before headlines turned a quiet Alberta community into a symbol of horror, the Richardson household looked like something ordinary on the surface. Not perfect, not extraordinary, just a family trying to hold structure in a world that was slowly becoming more complicated for everyone inside it. To understand what happened in April 2006, you have to understand what was already happening long before that night. Inside the walls of that home, in the small silences between conversations, in the way a 12-year-old girl started to drift emotionally away from the people who loved her most. Jasmine Richardson was, at the time, a child standing at the edge of adolescence. 12 years old is a strange in-between age, where childhood hasn't fully let go, but the desire for independence starts to grow like something uncontrollable. To those who knew her early in life, she was not described as violent or rebellious. She was quiet in a way that made adults assume she was well-behaved. She followed instructions. She did her schoolwork. She was present in the home, even if emotionally she was beginning to step half a foot outside of it. But quiet does not always mean simple, and obedience does not always mean peace. Her family, like many families in small Canadian towns, operated within a structure of expectations. There were rules about school, about friends, about behavior, about safety. Her parents were not absent. They were not indifferent. If anything, they were attentive in a way that becomes complicated during early teenage years. Attention at that stage of life can feel like protection, but it can also feel like restriction. What an adult sees as guidance, a child approaching adolescence might experience as control. This gap in perception is where many family conflicts begin. In Jasmine's case, it widened quietly at first. There were changes in tone during conversations, small disagreements that lingered longer than they used to. A request to stay home instead of going out could turn into frustration. A question about where she had been could be interpreted as interrogation rather than concern. These are not unusual patterns in families with teenagers. What made this situation different was not the presence of conflict, but the direction began to take. Because at some point, Jasmine's emotional world stopped revolving primarily around her family and started revolving around someone outside it. Jeremy Steinke entered her life at a moment when she was still forming her identity. He was not a peer. He was not a classmate. He was a young adult in his early 20s, already shaped by experiences and choices that place him in a completely different psychological space. To an outside observer, the age difference alone would have been alarming. But relationships like this do not begin with alarm. They begin with attention. Attention that feels rare. Attention that feels intense. Attention that feels like being seen in a way no one else manages to provide. Jeremy presented himself as someone outside the structure Jasmine was growing up in. He was older, more experienced, and carried an image that separated him from the world of school, parents, and rules. He dressed in a way that signaled rebellion, not necessarily because of fashion, but because of identity. He positioned himself as someone who lived beyond normal expectations. And for a young teenager beginning to feel constrained by those expectations, that image can become magnetic. What is often misunderstood in cases like this is how quickly emotional dependency can form when one person holds significantly more psychological influence than the other. Jasmine was not entering a relationship on equal footing. She was entering a dynamic where admiration could easily shift into dependence, and dependence could be shaped into something much more dangerous. As the relationship developed, the center of her emotional life began to shift. Time that was once spent within the family's structure became time spent anticipating communication from Jeremy. Thoughts that once revolved around school or home began to include him in every decision, every frustration, every desire for change. This is not something that happens all at once. It happens in increments that are almost invisible to the outside world. A message received at the right moment. A conversation that feels more validating than anything happening at home. A belief forming slowly that one environment understands her better than the other. Inside the Richardson household, this change did not go unnoticed. Parents are often the first to recognize when something feels different, even if they cannot immediately identify what that difference is. There may have been shifts in attitude, changes in communication patterns, or emotional distance that grew more pronounced over time. When questions were asked, responses may have become shorter, more defensive, or less open than before. From the parent's perspective, what they were witnessing was a child beginning to drift into a world they could not access. From Jasmine's perspective, she may have felt increasingly misunderstood, as though the people closest to her were becoming obstacles rather than support. This is where family conflict becomes psychologically dangerous, because each side begins to interpret the same situation in completely opposite ways. Parents often increase control when they sense loss of connection. Curfews become stricter. Conversations become more direct. Monitoring increases. But to a teenager already feeling constrained, these actions do not feel like care. They feel like pressure. And pressure, when combined with emotional attachment outside the family, creates tension that can escalate in unpredictable ways. Jeremy's role in this dynamic was not passive. Based on later analysis of communications and behavioral patterns, his influence extended beyond companionship. He reinforced a narrative that external authority figures, especially family, were limiting Jasmine's freedom. He framed conflict not as misunderstanding, but as opposition. In this framing, family rules were not protective boundaries. They were barriers that needed to be challenged. This shift in perception is critical, because once a family is no longer seen as a source of safety, but instead as an opposing force, emotional loyalty begins to fracture. At the same time, Jasmine was still a child. That fact does not disappear in psychological analysis, no matter how complex the surrounding circumstances become. 12 years old is an age where cognitive development is still incomplete, especially in areas related to long-term consequence evaluation, emotional regulation, and susceptibility to external influence. This means that even when decisions appear intentional, they can be heavily shaped by outside direction and emotional pressure. The relationship between Jasmine and Jeremy began to occupy more private space over time. Conversations that were once casual likely became more intense in emotional tone. Ideas were reinforced repeatedly. Frustrations were validated rather than balanced. And gradually, the world outside that relationship began to feel more distant, more antagonistic, more restrictive. Within the home, this may have manifested as increasing conflict, arguments that escalated faster, resistance to household expectations, emotional withdrawal from family interactions. The household environment, already structured around parental authority, would have started to feel more tense on both sides. It is important to understand that from the family's perspective, they were responding to what they perceived as a concerning shift in their child behavior. From Jasmine's perspective, she may have felt that her autonomy was being restricted at the exact moment she was discovering a sense of identity outside the home. Neither perspective exists in isolation. They feed into each other, creating cycles of escalation that become increasingly difficult to interrupt. And in the background of all this, Jeremy's presence remained constant, not always physically, but emotionally, through communication, through influence, through reinforcement of ideas that gradually restructured how Jasmine interpreted her environment. This is how a private relationship begins to reshape a family system from within, not through a single event, but through accumulation, through repetition, through emotional realignment that slowly shifts loyalty, perception, and trust. By the time the relationship reached its most critical stage, the separation between Jasmine's internal emotional world and her family environment had widened significantly. What once might have been normal teenage conflict had evolved into something far more unstable, where communication no longer served to resolve tension, but instead highlighted division. And in situations like this, where emotional dependence is reinforced externally, while family structure becomes increasingly strained internally, the risk of irreversible decisions grows dramatically. Because when a young mind begins to believe that escape from one environment requires alignment with another, the consequences of that belief are no longer theoretical. They become actionable. And in the case of the Richardson family, that shift in perception marked the beginning of the final descent toward a night that would change everything forever. The night of April 2006 did not announce itself with anything unusual. There was no dramatic weather shift, no unsettling silence that would later be remembered as a warning, no external sign that a family home in Alberta was about to become the center of one of the most disturbing crimes in Canadian history. It was, by all outward appearances, an ordinary evening inside a house that had seen many ordinary evenings before. Inside the Richardson home, life continued in its familiar rhythm. Rooms were lit with the soft glow of household lamps, the kind of light that makes everything feel safe even when emotions inside the house are not. But beneath that surface, the emotional structure of the family had already been weakened by months of tension, distance, and conflict that no longer resolved themselves through conversation. Jasmine Richardson was inside that home, 12 years old, still legally and developmentally a child, yet emotionally pulled into a situation far beyond her capacity to fully understand. The psychological distance between her and her family had grown so large that even shared physical space no longer meant shared emotional presence. She was there, but not fully there in the way her parents once knew her. Outside that home, Jeremy Steinke was also present in the unfolding sequence of events, though the exact details of his movements that night would later become part of the investigative reconstruction. What is clear from the evidence and testimony is that this was not an impulsive act. It was not something that emerged spontaneously in a moment of chaos. It was the outcome of a process that had been building over time, shaped by emotional escalation, distorted perception, and a relationship dynamic that had moved far beyond normal boundaries. As the evening progressed, the structure of the household began to shift from routine to something more fragile. Conversations that might have occurred were likely shortened or avoided. The emotional atmosphere inside the home, already strained for months, had reached a point where even silence carried weight. In many family systems under stress, This is the stage where communication no longer functions as connection, but as tension management. What happened next would later be reconstructed through investigation, forensic evidence, and confession accounts. But at the moment it unfolded, there was no external witness to interpret it in real time. The transition from ordinary night to violent rupture occurred within the private space of the home, behind closed doors, away from public awareness. The attack that followed was sudden in its execution, but not sudden in its origin. The victims inside the home were the parent of Jasmine Richardson and her younger brother, a child only 8 years old. They were inside what should have been the most secure environment in their lives. A home is supposed to be a boundary between the outside world and safety. That boundary was violated in a way that no family can ever truly prepare for. According to investigative findings, Jeremy Steinke was a primary actor in the physical violence that occurred that night. The sequence of events involved a confrontation inside the home that escalated rapidly into fatal violence. The exact sensory details of that moment, the sounds, the movements, the immediate reactions, were later reconstructed through forensic analysis rather than direct eyewitness testimony. But the outcome was clear. The family members were killed inside their own home. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not only the act itself, but the context in which it occurred. This was not a random intrusion. This was not an unknown attacker entering an unfamiliar space. This was a situation where personal relationships, emotional manipulation, and boundary erosion converge into a moment of irreversible violence. Inside the home, everything that had once represented normal family life collapsed into something unrecognizable. The spaces where daily routines had taken place became scenes of trauma. The places where conversations, meals, and ordinary interactions had occurred were transformed into evidence locations. After the violence occurred, the immediate aftermath entered a phase of rapid concealment and departure. Jeremy Steinke and Jasmine Richardson left the scene together. This transition from the home into the outside world marks one of the most psychologically complex aspects of the case, because it represents a shift from internal family conflict into external criminal flight. At this point, the situation was no longer contained within the emotional dynamics of a household. It had entered the realm of law enforcement, investigation, and public exposure, even though those systems had not yet fully engaged. The crime itself had occurred in private, but its consequences were already moving outward into public space. In the hours and days that followed, the disappearance of the family members became apparent. When communication attempts failed and normal routines were disrupted, concern quickly escalated. Family members, friends, and eventually authorities began to realize that something had gone fundamentally wrong inside the Richardson household. The absence of immediate answers created an emotional vacuum that was filled with fear and uncertainty. In cases involving sudden family disappearance, especially when children are involved, time becomes an urgent factor. Every passing hour without contact increases the likelihood that something serious has occurred. When investigators eventually entered the home, they encountered the physical aftermath of the events that had taken place. The scene provided evidence of violence, struggle, and fatal injury. Forensic teams began the process of documenting and analyzing every detail, not only to understand what happened, but to reconstruct the sequence of actions that led to it. At the same time, attention quickly turned toward identifying who was responsible and who might have left the scene. The presence of Jasmine Richardson in the aftermath created immediate complexity for investigators, because she was both part of the family system and part of the unfolding criminal narrative. Early in the investigation, there was confusion about roles, responsibilities, and levels of involvement. The relationship between Jasmine and Jeremy became a central focus, not only because of its personal significance, but because it appeared to be directly connected to the chain of events leading up to the crime. As information began to emerge, it became clear that the situation could not be understood to a simple binary of victim and offender. The emotional and behavioral dynamics leading up to the incident involved multiple layers of influence, dependency, and decision-making under conditions that were highly unstable. However, at the core of the legal and investigative findings remained one undeniable fact. The lives of 3 members of a family had been taken inside their home, and the person who initiated the violent act was Jeremy Steinke, with Jasmine Richardson present in a way that would later be heavily scrutinized in court proceedings. In the immediate aftermath, the focus of law enforcement shifted toward locating both individuals. The community response was one of shock and disbelief. People struggled to reconcile the image of a young girl from a local family with the severity of what had occurred. At the same time, there was growing recognition that the situation involved manipulation and psychological influence that extended beyond simple explanations. The incident did not end when the violence stopped inside the home. It continued in the form of investigation, public reaction, and the unfolding search for answers. But the moment that defined everything had already occurred inside the house in April 2006, when a family space that once represented safety was transformed into the site of irreversible loss. And from that point forward, nothing in the lives of those connected to the Richardson family would ever return to what it had been before. The first hours after the Richardson family was reported missing unfolded with a growing sense of unease that slowly turned into certainty that something deeply wrong had happened inside the home. In cases like this, there is often a brief window where hope still exists, where investigators and family members can imagine scenarios that are troubling but not catastrophic. A delayed return, a misunderstanding, a moment of disconnection that might still resolve itself. But that window closes quickly when reality begins to leave traces that cannot be explained away. Inside the quiet Alberta community, news traveled fast but cautiously at first. It began with simple concern, then repetition of unanswered calls, then the realization that multiple members of the same household were not responding. Friends and extended family began to gather information in fragments, trying to piece together the last known moments of normality. Each new detail made the absence more difficult to rationalize. When authorities were alerted, the initial classification of the situation was not immediately that of a confirmed homicide. At the beginning, it was still treated as a missing persons case. That classification carries a very specific emotional burden for investigators because it forces them to balance urgency with uncertainty. They must act quickly, but they must also avoid assumptions that could misdirect the investigation in its earliest and most fragile stage. Officers arrived at the Richardson residence with that mindset. A house that should have been familiar to neighbors now became a sealed environment of potential evidence. The exterior looked unchanged. There was no visible destruction from the outside, no obvious sign that anything catastrophic had occurred within its walls. This is often the most unsettling kind of crime scene because it violates expectations. The absence of external chaos creates a false impression of normality, even when something irreversible has already happened inside. When entry was made, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Investigators entering a space like this often describe a sensory transition that happens before any analysis begins. The air feels different. The silence is heavier. The ordinary structure of a home becomes disrupted by subtle inconsistencies that signal distress long before anything is formally confirmed. What they encountered inside confirmed their worst suspicions. The interior of the home showed clear evidence of violent struggle and fatal events. Rooms that had once been part of daily life now contained indicators of a crime scene that required immediate forensic processing. The presence of multiple victims, including adults and a child, elevated the case instantly into one of the most serious categories of criminal investigation. The discovery phase of a homicide investigation is not just about finding bodies or confirming death. It is about reconstructing the last moments of life inside a space that has suddenly become static. Every object, every position, every disturbance in the environment becomes part of a silent narrative that investigators must interpret without emotional distortion. In this case, that narrative pointed toward a violent confrontation that had taken place within the home itself. As forensic teams began their work, attention was immediately drawn to the condition of the scene. Evidence suggested that the violence had not been accidental or isolated. It had occurred in a manner consistent with intentional harm, involving multiple points of contact and movement throughout the interior of the house. This was not a single location incident. It was a sequence that unfolded across space and time within the home. The presence of the youngest victim, an 8-year-old child, added an additional layer of emotional weight to the investigation. For first responders and forensic personnel, cases involving children are never processed purely as technical events. Even with professional distance, the psychological impact is unavoidable. The contrast between the expected safety of a home environment and the reality of what had occurred inside creates a cognitive dissonance that lingers long after the investigation concludes. As investigators documented the scene, they also began to reconstruct timelines. When was the last known contact with each family member? When did communication stop? When did external observers first notice something was wrong? These questions form the backbone of the early investigative framework because establishing time is essential to understanding sequence, and sequence is essential to identifying responsibility. At the same time, attention was shifting outside the home. The discovery inside the residence confirmed that this was not a simple missing persons case. It was now a homicide investigation. That shift triggered a broader law enforcement response, including coordination between local police units and specialized investigative teams. One of the earliest challenges was the absence of immediate suspects physically present at the scene. The individuals believed to be connected to the events were no longer inside the home when authorities arrived. This introduced an urgent secondary objective, determining their location and movements following the incident. Investigators began tracing digital and physical footprints. Communications records, electronic activity, and witness observations all became critical sources of information. In modern investigations, especially those involving younger individuals and digital communication, electronic traces often provide the first reliable map of post-incident movement. It was through this process that the relationship between Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke became more central to the investigation. What initially appeared as a family disappearance linked to internal violence was now clearly connected to an external individual with a direct emotional and relational link to the household. This shifted the investigative focus from purely domestic interpretation to a broader relational analysis. As details emerged, a timeline began to form that placed both individuals leaving the vicinity of the home shortly after the fatal events. This movement indicated coordination, or at minimum, shared awareness of what had occurred. However, the psychological interpretation of that coordination would later become one of the most debated aspects of the case, particularly in relation to Jasmine's level of agency versus influence. At the community level, reactions began to intensify. The realization that a family had been killed inside their own home created shock that spread quickly beyond local boundaries. People struggled to process the involvement of a 12-year-old girl in any capacity within such a violent event. The cognitive dissonance between childhood and criminal violence made the case emotionally difficult to comprehend, even before all facts were fully established. In the hours following discovery, media attention began to build. The case transitioned from local tragedy to national concern. However, at this early stage, many details were still uncertain, and investigators were careful not to release information prematurely. Maintaining integrity of evidence and avoiding public interference in suspect location efforts became a priority. Inside the investigation itself, forensic analysis continued to build a clearer picture of what had occurred within the home. Patterns of evidence supported the conclusion that the violence had been direct and deliberate. There were no indicators suggesting accidental death or external intrusion by unknown parties. Instead, all signs pointed toward individuals known to the victims. As the investigation progressed, attention increasingly centered on the question of motive and influence. Why this family? Why this sequence of actions? What psychological and relational dynamics had led to this point? These questions do not have immediate answers in the early stages of a homicide investigation, but they begin to shape how evidence is interpreted and what investigative paths are prioritized. At this stage, the Richardson home was no longer just a residence. It had become a fixed point in a larger investigative network, a place from which all subsequent actions would be traced backward. Every decision made inside the house during the incident would later be reconstructed piece by piece, not only to establish legal responsibility, but to understand how a situation of this magnitude could develop within a family environment. What remained most striking in the aftermath of discovery was the contrast between the normal appearance of the home from the outside and the irreversible violence that had occurred inside. That contrast became one of the defining emotional elements of the case, shaping how the public would later perceive not only the crime itself, but the fragile boundary between ordinary life and catastrophic rupture. And as investigators moved forward from the scene, collecting evidence, documenting every detail, and expanding the search for the individuals involved, one reality had already become clear. The discovery inside the house had transformed everything. There was no longer uncertainty about whether something terrible had happened. The only questions left were how far the consequences would extend, and how long it would take for the full truth to emerge. When a homicide investigation begins to expand beyond the walls of a crime scene, it enters a phase where physical evidence alone is no longer sufficient. The case of the Richardson family quickly moved into the second stage, where timelines, relationships, psychological patterns, and digital footprints began to matter as much as forensic traces. What had started as a discovery inside a home in Alberta was now becoming a multi-layered investigation into two missing individuals and the sequence of decisions that had led them away from the scene. The first priority for investigators was containment of information in cases involving ongoing suspects, especially when a suspect had fled the immediate area. Every detail released to the public can potentially influence their behavior. This means law enforcement often operates in a narrow corridor between urgency and discretion. Too little information, and the public cannot assist. Too much information, and suspects may adapt, conceal themselves, or destroy evidence. At this stage, the identities of Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke became central not only to the narrative of the case, but to its operational structure. Investigators were now dealing with a dual-subject scenario: a minor whose involvement required careful legal handling, and an adult suspect whose actions placed him squarely within the scope of a homicide investigation. The dynamic between them was no longer just a background element. It had become the core of the case. One of the earliest investigative breakthroughs came from communication analysis. In modern cases, digital communication often provides the most immediate window into pre-incident planning and post-incident behavior. Text messages, online chats, email records, and social media activity began to reveal a pattern of interaction between the two individuals that extended beyond what the family had originally understood. These communications showed not only emotional attachment, but also increasing isolation from external influences. Over time, the relationship had developed its own internal logic, a self-contained emotional environment in which outside voices, including those of family members, were reframed as interference rather than protection. This reframing is a critical psychological marker in cases involving manipulation dynamics, because it indicates a shift in perceived authority from family structure to external partner influence. At the same time, investigators were reconstructing Jeremy Steinke's background. Unlike Jasmine, whose life had been defined by family structure and school environment, Steinke presented a more fragmented history. His social patterns suggested instability, frequent movement between environments, and a tendency toward identity construction through external aesthetics and persona development. This included his adoption of alternative cultural expressions that reinforced a self-image of rebellion and detachment from conventional social norms. What made this combination particularly significant was the asymmetry of influence. While both individuals were emotionally engaged in the relationship, the power imbalance was evident in age, experience, and psychological maturity. This imbalance became a key focus for investigators attempting to understand how decision-making responsibility was distributed in the events leading up to the crime. As the investigation deepened, attention turned to movement after the incident. Once the initial violence inside the home had occurred, both individuals had left the scene. Establishing their route of departure became essential to predicting their current location and understanding whether they were acting in coordination or separation. Witness statements began to provide fragments of information. Individuals reported possible sightings, unusual travel behavior, and conversations that suggested a young couple moving together under uncertain circumstances. However, as is often the case in early-stage manhunts, these reports varied in reliability. Investigators had to separate perception from fact, filtering credible leads from emotional reconstruction by witnesses who were reacting to breaking news. Meanwhile, forensic evidence in the home continued to be analyzed in detail. Blood pattern analysis, object placement, and trace evidence helped confirm the sequence of events inside the residence. These findings reinforced the conclusion that the violence had been intentional and directed toward specific individuals within the household. There was no indication of random intrusion or external burglary. Everything pointed back to internal access and personal connection. This realization intensified the focus on motive reconstruction. Why would such an outcome occur within a family environment? What psychological sequence leads from emotional conflict to irreversible violence? Investigators and behavioral analysts began to examine the progression of tension within the household prior to the incident. Family reports and prior interactions suggested a period of escalating conflict centered around the relationship between Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke. The parents had attempted intervention through restriction of contact, a common parental response in situations involving concerning external influence. However, in many psychological cases, restriction without broader relational repair can unintentionally intensify perceived opposition. The home environment becomes reframed in the subject's mind as a site of control rather than care. This reframing is not in itself sufficient to explain violence, but it contributes to a psychological environment in which extreme solutions may begin to appear internally justifiable within a distorted belief system. Investigators were careful to note that understanding this progression is not the same as excusing it. It is an attempt to map how perception shifts under emotional pressure. As days passed, the search for missing individuals expanded beyond Alberta. Law enforcement agencies began coordinating across regions, sharing data and surveillance leads. The case had now reached a national level of attention. The possibility that the suspects had crossed regional boundaries added complexity to tracking efforts, requiring coordination between multiple jurisdictions. During this phase, behavioral profiling was introduced as an additional tool. Analysts attempted to predict likely movement patterns based on personality indicators, resource availability, and known associations. In Jeremy Steinke's case, his lifestyle suggested limited financial stability and a tendency toward improvisation rather than structured planning. In contrast, the presence of Jasmine introduced an additional variable, unpredictability due to age and emotional volatility. Despite these analytical efforts, the immediate location of the pair remained uncertain. This uncertainty created pressure not only on investigators but also on the public, who were following the case with growing intensity. Media coverage began to shape perception of the suspects, often simplifying complex psychological dynamics into more digestible narratives. This is a common challenge in high-profile cases, where public understanding and investigative nuance do not always align. Internally, investigators remain focused on evidence continuity. Every digital trace, every financial transaction, every possible communication channel was examined. The goal was to identify the moment when the suspects left structured communication networks and enter what investigators refer to as digital silence. This transition point often marks the beginning of physical evasion behavior. As the investigation progressed, it became increasingly clear that the case could not be understood solely through traditional criminal frameworks. The involvement of minor, the relational dynamics, and the psychological progression required a multidisciplinary approach combining criminal investigation, behavioral psychology, and digital forensics. At this stage, the investigation was no longer just about locating two individuals. It was about reconstructing a system of influence that had developed over time and culminated in a catastrophic outcome. Each new piece of evidence added structure to that reconstruction, but also raised deeper questions about how such a sequence of events could remain hidden until it reached its final, irreversible point. And as law enforcement continued its search, one reality became increasingly apparent. The investigation had already moved beyond a question of who was involved. It was now focused on how far the consequences of their actions would extend, and how quickly the remaining gaps in the timeline could be closed before the suspects disappeared entirely from the investigative map. In every major homicide investigation, there is a point where the case stops being a search in the dark and becomes a structured pursuit. It is rarely a single dramatic revelation. More often, it is a convergence of small inconsistencies that begin to align into a pattern too coherent to ignore. In the Richardson case, that moment of convergence arrived through a combination of digital evidence, behavioral observation, and a critical gap in the narrative that the suspects had failed to account for. By this stage, investigators had already reconstructed a partial timeline of events leading up to the disappearance of Jeremy Steinke and Jasmine Richardson. What remained unclear was not what had happened inside the home, but what happened immediately after they left it. That gap, measured in hours rather than days, became the focal point of the entire operation, because in that narrow window of time, Every decision they made would determine whether they could remain hidden or whether they would eventually be traced. The first major shift came from digital forensic analysis. Investigators examining electronic accounts associated with the victims discovered something unusual. Even after the estimated time of death, certain online communications continued to originate from accounts belonging to one of the household members. At first glance, this could have suggested delayed activity, automated systems, or misinterpretation of timestamps. But as analysts examined the structure and content of these messages, a different picture emerged. The language used in these communications did not match the known behavioral patterns of the individual they were attributed to. The tone was detached, performative, and structured in a way that suggested intentional construction rather than spontaneous expression. More importantly, the messages appear designed to create a narrative, a version of events in which the missing individual had voluntarily left home and chosen not to return. This detail immediately raised suspicion. In many missing persons cases, false narratives are often introduced by suspects attempting to delay investigation or redirect attention. What made this case particularly significant was the timing. These messages were not part of a long-term deception strategy. They were deployed immediately after the disappearance, suggesting premeditation and narrative control. While digital analysts worked on confirming source origins, field investigators focused on physical movement patterns. Surveillance data from road networks, combined with witness reports, began to outline a possible route taken by the suspects after leaving the residence. Although fragmented, these observations indicated coordinated travel rather than random dispersal. This was important because it suggested that both individuals were acting together rather than independently scattering after the incident. At the same time, investigators began to re-examine the relationship dynamics between Jeremy Steinke and Jasmine Richardson with greater precision. Early assumptions had treated the relationship as emotionally intense but relatively linear in influence. However, deeper analysis suggested a more complex structure rather than a simple dominant-submissive dynamic. The interaction appeared to involve mutual reinforcement of increasingly distorted perceptions. In this environment, Jeremy Steinke's role was not merely that of an older partner exerting control. He functioned as a stabilizing force within a shared narrative system that justified actions through emotional reinterpretation. Family resistance was reframed not as protection, but as opposition. External boundaries were not interpreted as safeguards, but as constraints. Within that logic system, escalation could be perceived not as violation, but as resolution. This understanding became crucial when evaluating post-incident behavior. Investigators noted that instead of immediately dispersing or attempting long-term concealment, the suspect engaged in short-term movement that appeared inconsistent with a fully developed escape strategy. They changed locations, but not identities in a systematic way. They avoided immediate capture, but did not fully sever recognizable behavioral patterns. That inconsistency became the opening investigators needed. A breakthrough occurred when cross-referencing digital traces with known associates and communication networks. A small but critical link was identified between Jeremy Steinke and a previous acquaintance who had not been initially considered relevant to the investigation. This individual provided information that helped narrow down possible geographic locations where Steinke might seek temporary refuge. It was not a direct location disclosure. Rather, it was a behavioral insight. Steinke, according to this contact, tended to return to familiar environments when under stress, particularly locations where he felt socially invisible or unremarkable. This type of psychological profiling is often more valuable than direct evidence because it allows investigators to predict movement rather than simply react to it. Using this insight, law enforcement expanded surveillance focused at areas outside the immediate jurisdiction. This shift marked a transition from reactive investigation to predictive containment strategy. Instead of searching everywhere, they began concentrating resources on specific environments that match behavioral likelihood. Meanwhile, public pressure on the case continued to grow. Media coverage intensified, and the identities of the suspects became widely circulated. This had a dual effect. On one hand, it increased the risk of public sightings. On the other hand, it increased the psychological pressure on the suspects themselves, making prolonged evasion more difficult. It was during this period of heightened exposure that the first credible sighting reports began to emerge. Individuals in neighboring regions reported seeing a young couple matching the descriptions provided by authorities. These reports were not immediately confirmed, but when cross-referenced with digital and behavioral data, they began to form a coherent pattern. Each sighting added a small piece to a larger map, and when those pieces were assembled, they pointed toward a narrowing corridor of movement. The suspects were no longer freely mobile. Their options were shrinking. The decisive breakthrough came not from a single dramatic capture, but from alignment, multiple independent data streams, digital activity, witness reports, behavioral profiling, and geographic probability mapping began to converge on a consistent zone of activity. Once that convergence reached a certain threshold, law enforcement was able to deploy targeted surveillance resources. At this stage, the investigation entered its final operational phase. Officers were no longer searching broadly. They were monitoring specific points of contact, waiting for confirmation rather than discovery. This shift is subtle but critical in law enforcement strategy. It transforms uncertainty into anticipation. What ultimately confirmed the breakthrough was a combination of recognition and hesitation. A situation occurred in which one of the suspects was identified in a public setting. The recognition did not immediately result in confrontation. Instead, it triggered a controlled response, allowing authorities to verify identity before initiating action. This moment marked the collapse of anonymity. From that point forward, the investigative question was no longer where the suspects might be. It was how quickly containment could be completed without further escalation or loss of control. The breakthrough phase also revealed something important about the structure of the case itself. It demonstrated that the investigation had not succeeded because of a single technological advancement or a single witness statement. It succeeded because multiple systems of information, each incomplete on its own, had been layered together until they formed a stable pattern. In hindsight, this is often how complex cases are resolved, not through sudden revelation, but through accumulation of partial truths that eventually become impossible to ignore. As law enforcement prepared to move into final apprehension procedures, one reality had become clear. The suspects had not disappeared into uncertainty. They had been steadily tracked, even when invisible, through patterns they themselves did not realize they were leaving behind. And in that realization lay the core of the breakthrough. The understanding that no matter how fragmented a trail may appear at first, human behavior itself tends to create structure, and structure can always be followed. When a criminal investigation reaches a courtroom, the nature of the story changes once again. What was once a fluid sequence of events interpreted through evidence becomes a structured narrative tested under legal standards. In the case of Jeremy Steinke and Jasmine Richardson, the courtroom was not simply a place to determine guilt. It became the arena where psychology, law, and public morality collided in their most concentrated form. By the time the trial began, the facts of the case were already widely known in their broad outlines. The identities of the victims, the relationship between the accused, and the basic sequence of events had circulated through national and international media. However, the courtroom demanded something more precise than public understanding. It required a reconstruction of intent, responsibility, and individual agency within a sequence of actions that had already shattered a family and deeply disturbed a nation. From the beginning, the prosecution's approach focused on establishing coordination. They did not treat the case as a spontaneous eruption of violence, but as a structured sequence of decisions that unfolded over time. Their central argument was that the crime did not begin on the night of the killings, but long before, in the gradual formation of a shared plan shaped through communication, influence, and emotional reinforcement. In presenting their case, prosecutors carefully reconstructed the relationship between Steinke and Richardson. They emphasized the asymmetry of age, experience, and psychological maturity. This was not simply a factual observation, but a legal and moral foundation for understanding how influence operates in relationships where one party holds significantly greater life experience and emotional leverage. The courtroom heard detailed descriptions of how the relationship had evolved, how communication patterns intensified, and how family boundaries became points of conflict rather than resolution. These elements were not introduced to explain away responsibility, but to establish context for how decisions were formed and reinforced over time. The most difficult aspect of the trial, however, centered on the role of Jasmine Richardson. At just 12 years old at the time of the offense, her presence in the case created a legal and ethical complexity that no simple framework could resolve. The prosecution had to navigate a narrow line between acknowledging her age and addressing the gravity of her involvement. The defense, on the other hand, focused heavily on psychological influence, arguing that her capacity for independent decision-making had been significantly compromised. Expert witnesses were called to discuss adolescent cognitive development, susceptibility to external influence, and the formation of identity during early adolescence. These testimonies were not abstract academic discussions. They were directly tied to the question of whether a child in such a situation can fully comprehend the consequences of actions shaped under intense emotional pressure and relational dependency. At the same time, the prosecution introduced evidence related to Jeremy Steinke's behavior and planning. They described how he had positioned himself within the relationship dynamic, not merely as a partner, but as an active participant in shaping perceptions of conflict and resolution. The evidence suggested a gradual escalation of ideas, where violent outcomes were not introduced abruptly, but normalized through repeated framing and reinforcement. Physical evidence presented in court reinforced the prosecution's narrative. Forensic findings from the crime scene confirmed that the events inside the home had been deliberate and targeted. There was no indication of external intrusion, supporting the conclusion that access had been granted by someone within the household environment. Digital evidence further supported the timeline of communication and movement leading up to the incident. The courtroom also heard testimony regarding the aftermath of the crime, including the actions taken by the accused after leaving the residence. These details were presented not to sensationalize the events, but to demonstrate continuity of behavior. The prosecution argued that the post-incident actions were consistent with an attempt to manage perception and delay detection, rather than an uncontrolled flight response. The defense strategy centered on fragmentation of responsibility. For Jeremy Steinke, the argument focused on mental state, personality structure, and the influence of external circumstances. For Jasmine Richardson, the defense emphasized developmental immaturity and emotional dependency. They argued that her role could not be interpreted through the same lens as that of an adult participant, and that her actions must be understood within the context of manipulation and coercive influence. This division of responsibility created one of the most emotionally and legally complex trials in Canadian criminal history. The jury was not simply asked to determine whether crimes had been committed. They were asked to assign meaning to those crimes within a framework that included age, influence, intent, and moral accountability. Throughout the proceedings, the courtroom remained tense. Families of the victims were present, their reactions restrained but deeply visible in moments where particularly graphic or emotionally charged evidence was presented. The weight of the case extended beyond legal arguments. It carried the presence of irreversible loss, which no testimony or legal reasoning could fully address. After weeks of testimony, cross-examination, and legal argumentation, the jury was given instructions to deliberate. This phase of the trial is often invisible to the public, but it represents one of the most critical stages in the justice process. Inside the deliberation room, the narrative constructed over weeks of testimony is distilled into a binary decision that must account for nuance while ultimately producing a definitive outcome. When the verdict was finally returned, the courtroom experienced a moment of concentrated silence. Jeremy Steinke was found guilty of first-degree murder. The decision reflected the jury's acceptance of premeditation and intentional participation in the crime. The legal system had reached a conclusion regarding his role without ambiguity. The outcome regarding Jasmine Richardson was shaped by her age and legal classification as a minor. The court acknowledged her involvement, but processed it through the framework of youth justice. This distinction created immediate public debate, as many struggled to reconcile the emotional weight of the case with the legal boundaries that define responsibility for minors. Sentencing reflected these distinctions. Jeremy Steinke received a life sentence with no possibility of parole for an extended period, consistent with the classification of first-degree murder under Canadian law. For him, the courtroom outcome represented a permanent removal from society under conditions of maximum legal severity. For Richardson, the consequences were structured differently, focusing on rehabilitation within the youth justice system rather than purely punitive measures. This decision was grounded in legal principles that distinguish between developmental stages of psychological maturity, but also became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Outside the courtroom, public reaction was intense and divided. Some viewed the verdict as a necessary application of law based on evidence and legal standards. Others struggled with the emotional implications, particularly the idea that a child had been involved in the planning and execution of such a devastating act. The case became a focal point for broader discussions about influence, responsibility, and the limits of legal categorization in cases involving minors. Media coverage amplified these debates, often simplifying complex legal reasoning into emotionally charged narratives. This created a secondary layer of interpretation that existed alongside the formal judicial outcome. In many ways, the trial did not end the story. It expanded it into public consciousness, where it continued to evolve through discussion, analysis, and cultural reflection. Yet within the formal structure of the justice system, the verdict represented closure in one sense and fragmentation in another, closure, because legal responsibility had been assigned. Fragmentation, because the underlying questions about influence, vulnerability, and moral agency remained deeply contested. As the courtroom emptied and the formal proceedings concluded, what remained was not simply a case resolved, but a system tested. The trial had examined not only individual actions, but the boundaries of how law interprets human behavior under extreme psychological and relational conditions. And even after the final gavel fell, the most difficult questions continue to linger, not in the courtroom, but in the space between legal judgment and human understanding. In the years following the trial, the case of Jeremy Steinke and Jasmine Richardson gradually shifted from active legal proceedings into a broader landscape of public memory and academic analysis. What remains after a case like this is never just a set of legal outcomes. It is a collection of unanswered emotional questions, institutional lessons, and human consequences that continue to unfold long after the courtroom doors are closed. For the families of the victims, the passage of time did not function as resolution. Instead, it created a different kind of permanence. The absence left behind in the household became a fixed point around which daily life had to reorganize itself. There is no legal mechanism that can restore the sound of a voice that is no longer present, nor replace the routines that were interrupted in a single night. What remains is adaptation, not closure. The community in Alberta, where the events took place, also experienced a long-term psychological impact. In smaller or tightly connected communities, violent crime does not remain abstract. It reshapes how people perceive safety within familiar spaces. Homes, streets, and schools are no longer seen in the same way after an incident that challenges the assumption of security within everyday life. Even years later, the memory of the case continues to influence how people talk about trust, parenting, and adolescent relationships. One of the most significant aspects of the aftermath was the ongoing debate about responsibility. The case forced legal experts, psychologists, educators, and the general public to confront difficult questions about how responsibility is assigned when age, influence, and emotional dependency intersect. There was no simple answer that could fully satisfy all perspectives. Instead, the case became a reference point for discussing the limits of binary thinking in criminal justice. In academic circles, the Richardson case is often examined through the lens of developmental psychology and coercive influence. Researchers analyze how identity formation during early adolescence can be shaped by external relationships, particularly when those relationships involve significant power imbalances. The case is frequently used to illustrate how emotional attachment can alter perception of authority, boundaries, and consequence evaluation in developing minds. At the same time, the case also appears in discussions about adult responsibility in relationships involving minors. Jeremy Steinke's role continues to be studied as an example of how influence can be exercised in ways that are not always immediately visible as coercion in a legal sense, but may still produce profound behavioral consequences. This dual perspective ensures that the case remains relevant not only as a historical event, but as an ongoing subject of analysis in criminology and psychology. Media representations of the case also contributed to its long-term presence in public discourse. Over time, documentaries, articles, and discussions revisit the events from multiple angles, each emphasizing different aspects of the narrative. Some focus on the psychological dynamics within the relationship, others on the legal outcomes, and others on the impact on the victim's family. This multiplicity of perspectives ensured that the case was never reduced to a single interpretation. However, media attention also created challenges. The simplification of complex psychological and legal issues into easily digestible narratives sometimes led to misunderstandings about the nature of responsibility and influence in the case. This tension between public understanding and academic nuance remains a recurring theme whenever the case is discussed in broader contexts. For Jasmine Richardson, the aftermath of the case involved a legal and personal transformation that was heavily protected by identity restrictions. Her rehabilitation process, conducted within the framework of youth justice, was designed to focus on psychological development and reintegration under strict conditions. The decision to eventually release her under anonymity remains one of the most debated aspects of the case, reflecting the ongoing tension between rehabilitation principles and public perception of justice. Jeremy Steinke's life after conviction followed a different trajectory, defined by long-term incarceration and the legal consequences of first-degree murder. Within the correctional system, his case is often referenced in discussions about premeditation, psychological profiling, and the influence of fantasy-based identity construction on real-world behavior. His actions are studied not as isolated events, but as part of a broader inquiry into how personal narratives can escalate into criminal outcomes when left unchecked. Beyond the individuals directly involved, the case also influenced policy discussions within Canada regarding youth protection, digital communication monitoring, and parental intervention strategies. It highlighted how rapidly relationships can develop outside parental awareness in the digital age, and how difficult it can be for families to identify early warning signs when communication occurs in private, encrypted, or emotionally insulated environments. Educational programs and awareness initiatives that followed the case began to place greater emphasis on communication between parents and adolescents, as well as on recognizing patterns of emotional withdrawal and external influence. While no single case can define policy, the Richardson case contributed to a growing recognition of the complexity of adolescent social environments in the context of modern technology. Despite these institutional and academic responses, the emotional core of the case remains unchanged. At its center is a family that experienced irreversible loss and a set of decisions made under conditions that continue to provoke debate about agency and influence. The legal system provided a structured response, but it could not fully address the emotional weight carried by those directly affected. Over time, the case has come to represent a broader cautionary narrative about the intersection of adolescence, emotional vulnerability, and external influence. It is often referenced not only for what happened, but for what it reveals about how relationships can evolve when boundaries become blurred and external guidance is replaced by internalized emotional logic. There is also a deeper reflection that emerges from long-term examination of the case. It is the recognition that not all tragedies arise from sudden impulses. Some develop gradually, through accumulated decisions, reinforced perceptions, and environments where warning signs are either missed or misunderstood. This does not simplify responsibility, but it does emphasize the importance of early awareness and intervention in situations where emotional dynamics begin to shift in concerning directions. Today, the Richardson case remains part of Canada's collective memory of criminal history. It is studied not only as a legal case, but as a human story that challenges assumptions about age, influence, and responsibility. It continues to appear in discussions about how societies interpret complex interpersonal dynamics within the framework of law and morality. And perhaps the most enduring aspect of the case is not found in its legal conclusion, but in its unresolved emotional resonance. The courtroom reached a verdict, but the questions it raised about human behavior, influence, and vulnerability continue to circulate long after the case itself has ended. In that sense, the aftermath is not a final chapter. It is an ongoing reflection, carried forward by everyone who encounters the story and is forced, even briefly, to consider how fragile the boundaries of safety, trust, and understanding can become when human relationships move into their most extreme and distorted forms. When cases like this are examined years later, they tend to lose their immediate shock value in the public mind, but they gain something else: interpretive weight. What once felt like a singular tragedy begins to function as a reference point, a lens through which other cases are measured and understood. The Richardson-Steinke case has become exactly that within Canadian criminal discourse, not because of its brutality alone, but because of the uncomfortable questions it refuses to resolve cleanly. One of the most enduring tensions in this case lies in how society defines responsibility when development is incomplete. A 12-year-old does not possess the same cognitive architecture as an adult. Neuroscience has repeatedly shown that impulse control, long-term consequence evaluation, and susceptibility to external influence are still forming at that age. Yet legal systems are still required to draw a line, to assign categories, to decide where rehabilitation ends and culpability begins. This case is directly on that fault line, resisting easy classification. Jeremy Steinke's role, in contrast, continues to be examined through the framework of adult accountability. His actions demonstrate what happens when emotional reinforcement and personal ideology converge into a closed system of justification. In such systems, external resistance is not processed as moral correction, but as obstruction. Once that shift occurs, violence can be reframed internally as necessity rather than transgression. This psychological mechanism is not unique to this case, but here it was expressed with devastating clarity. Another layer that continues to be discussed is the structure of influence itself. The relationship between Steinke and Richardson has been analyzed in terms of asymmetry, but not only in age. There was also asymmetry in life experience, social anchoring, and emotional stability. In such dynamics, influence does not always appear as direct instruction. It often emerges as validation, repetition, and emotional reframing. Over time, the younger individual's internal narrative can begin to mirror the older partner's constructed worldview. What makes this case particularly important is how clearly that process can be reconstructed from later evidence. In forensic psychology, this is often used as an example of relational escalation without immediate external visibility. There were no obvious early interventions, no single moment that triggered alarms strong enough to stop the progression. Instead, there was a gradual normalization of ideas that, outside the relationship, would have been immediately rejected. This gap between private normalization and public acceptability is one of the most critical blind spots in prevention systems. At a societal level, the case also exposes limitations in how families interpret behavioral change. The Richardson family's attempts to reassert boundaries were based on traditional assumptions about authority and adolescence. From their perspective, restricting contact and enforcing rules should have restored equilibrium. However, in psychologically fused relationships, increased restriction can sometimes intensify internal alignment between the influenced individual and the external partner. This does not mean intervention is ineffective, but it highlights how complex and counterintuitive these dynamics can become. The justice system's handling of the case also continues to be debated in academic environments. The separation of legal responsibility between adult and minor participants reflects established principles, but the emotional reaction from the public often conflicts with those principles. This tension is not unique to this case, but is amplified here because of the extreme nature of the outcome and the age of one of the participants. The law must operate on categories, but human perception often operates on emotional continuity, which does not divide responsibility so cleanly. Over time, the case has also become part of broader discussions about digital culture and adolescent vulnerability. Although the events occurred in 2006, before the full maturity of modern social media ecosystems, the underlying patterns are now even more relevant. Online communication allows relationships to form in partially insulated environments, where external feedback is limited and emotional reinforcement can intensify without interruption. In such contexts, influence can develop faster than traditional family structures can detect or respond to. Educators and researchers often reference this case when discussing early warning signs, not in the sense of predictable certainty, but as a reminder that behavioral shifts rarely occur without preceding emotional or social transitions. Withdrawal, secrecy, heightened emotional dependency, and conflict redefinition are all patterns that, when combined, can indicate deeper relational restructuring. The challenge is that none of these signs are definitive on their own, which makes intervention both necessary and difficult. What remains most striking, even after all analysis, is the absence of a single explanatory factor. There is no singular cause that fully accounts for how events unfolded. There is only convergence, psychological vulnerability, relational imbalance, emotional reinforcement, and situational opportunity aligning in a way that produced irreversible consequences. This absence of a simple cause is precisely what makes the case so persistently studied. In reflecting on this case as a whole, it becomes clear that its significance is not limited to the criminal acts themselves. Its deeper impact lies in how it forces a confrontation with uncertainty. It challenges the assumption that harmful outcomes always emerge from clearly identifiable danger signals. Instead, it demonstrates how ordinary environments can contain latent pathways to extreme outcomes when relational and psychological conditions align in specific ways. Ultimately, the story of Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke is not only a narrative about crime, it is a narrative about perception, how individuals interpret authority, how emotional bonds reshape moral boundaries, and how systems designed to protect can sometimes fail to recognize transformation until it's too late. It is also a narrative about the limits of understanding itself. Because even after investigation, trial, and years of analysis, parts of the story remain interpreted rather than fully resolved. And that is why the case continues to be revisited, not because it lacks answers in a legal sense, but because it raises questions that legal answers alone cannot fully contain. Years after the legal proceedings ended, the case of Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke no longer exists only in the realm of criminal justice records. It has been absorbed into a broader cultural and educational context where it is repeatedly revisited not for its shock value, but for what it reveals about the mechanics of human behavior under emotional pressure. In many ways, the case has shifted from a news event into a case study, stripped of immediacy but intensified in analytical significance. Within academic discussions, the case is often placed alongside other incidents involving adolescent involvement in serious crimes influenced by older partners. What makes it persistently relevant is not only the age of participants, but the clarity with which it demonstrates gradual psychological restructuring. Researchers examining the case frequently point out that it does not conform to the typical model of sudden radicalization or impulsive violence. Instead, it represents a slow accumulation of emotional reframing, where boundaries that once felt absolute gradually lose definition. This process is particularly important in developmental psychology. Adolescence is a period marked by identity formation, where external validation plays a disproportionately large role in shaping self-concept. In the Richardson case, this developmental stage intersected with a relationship that provided intense emotional reinforcement outside the family structure. Over time, that reinforcement became more influential than traditional authority figures, creating a competing system of emotional logic. From a criminological perspective, this is one of the most difficult types of cases to prevent. Unlike situations where external threats are clearly visible, relationally embedded influence operates internally within trust structures. It does not announce itself through obvious warning signs. Instead, it often appears as emotional closeness, intensified communication, and gradual distancing from established support systems. By the time external observers recognize the shift, the internal alignment may already be deeply entrenched. Another dimension of the case that continues to be analyzed is the role of perception versus intent. Legal systems are designed to evaluate actions and intent based on evidence, but psychological development does not always produce clearly defined intent at every stage of decision-making. In cases involving minors influenced by adults, intent can become fragmented, distributed across relational interactions rather than existing as a single autonomous decision. This fragmentation complicates not only legal interpretation, but also moral judgment. For the adult participant, Jeremy Steinke, the case is often examined as an example of relational exploitation combined with ideological justification. His role demonstrates how individuals can construct internal narratives that reframe external reality in ways that support increasingly extreme outcomes. Once a narrative system becomes self-reinforcing, contradictory information is often dismissed or reinterpreted. This mechanism is not unique to criminal behavior, but in this case it became directly connected to irreversible harm. The aftermath also continues to shape discussions about how institutions respond to early warning signals. In hindsight analysis, people often search for clear indicators that could have prevented escalation. However, One of the most consistent findings in this case is that the warning signs were not singular or dramatic. They were distributed across time and context, appearing as interpersonal conflict, emotional withdrawal, and shifting loyalty structures. The challenge for any preventive system is that none of these elements are individually sufficient to trigger intervention. Public memory of the case has also evolved over time. Immediately after the events, the dominant emotional response was shock and disbelief. Over time, this shifted toward analysis and debate. Today, the case is often referenced in discussions about adolescent vulnerability, coercive influence, and the limits of parental control in emotionally complex relationships. It has become part of a broader conversation about how modern social environments shape identity formation outside traditional family structures. At the same time, the case remains emotionally charged for those directly affected. For the families involved, academic analysis and public discussion do not replace personal loss. This tension between analytical distance and emotional reality is one of the most difficult aspects of long-term case legacy. A case can become intellectually understood while remaining emotionally unresolved. In educational contexts, the case is sometimes used as a cautionary example, but responsible discussion requires careful framing. It is not simply a story about manipulation or rebellion. It is a layered interaction of psychological development, emotional dependency, and escalating relational reinforcement. Simplifying it into a single lesson risks obscuring the very complexity that makes it important. Another lasting impact of the case is its contribution to discussions about youth justice philosophy. The distinction between punishment and rehabilitation becomes particularly difficult when cases involve severe outcomes and young participants. The legal system must balance accountability with the recognition of developmental capacity. This balance is not static. It evolves with societal values, scientific understanding, and legal precedent. The Richardson case remains part of that evolving discourse. Over time, technological change has also added new relevance to the case. In a digital environment where relationships can form rapidly and privately, the mechanisms of influence observed in this case are now more widely recognized as part of broader patterns of online social interaction. This does not mean the same outcomes are inevitable, but it does highlight the importance of awareness regarding emotional dependency and relational isolation in digital contexts. Ultimately, what endures most about this case is not any single detail, but the accumulation of intersecting factors that led to a collapse of normal boundaries. It is a reminder that human behavior is rarely shaped by one force alone. It emerges from interactions between environment, psychology, relationships, and timing. And in that sense, the legacy of the case is not confined to the past. It continues to exist in every discussion about vulnerability, influence, and responsibility, serving as a persistent example of how quickly ordinary emotional dynamics can transform into something irreversible when left unrecognized or unaddressed. When a case reaches a stage of retelling, something subtle changes in its meaning. It is no longer only about what happened, nor only about how it was investigated or judged. It becomes about what remains after every official system has finished speaking. Courts close cases, investigators archive files, and media cycles move on, but the human mind continues to revisit the unanswered emotional contours of what was experienced. The case of Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke belongs to that category of stories that resist final emotional closure. Even though the legal system assigned responsibility, and even though the sequence of events has been reconstructed with clarity, the emotional reality of what occurred continues to generate discomfort, reflection, and debate. That persistence is not a failure of understanding. It is a consequence of the case touching multiple layers of human development at once. One of those layers is the question of how identity forms under pressure. Adolescence is not a stable state. It is a transitional process where external influence can temporarily outweigh internal judgment. In this case, that developmental instability intersected with an external relationship that provided intense emotional reinforcement. The result was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual narrowing of perceived options, where alternatives outside the relationship began to feel less real or less accessible. Another layer is the role of emotional dependency. Human attachment systems are designed to prioritize connection, sometimes even over logic or long-term consequence. When that attachment becomes concentrated in a single relationship, especially one that is reinforced through secrecy or opposition to external authority, it can become disproportionately influential. This does not remove responsibility, but it helps explain how decision-making can become progressively constrained within an emotional framework. The legal system, by necessity, operates differently. It must define thresholds, assign categories, and produce outcomes that are administratively and morally structured. In doing so, it often compresses complex psychological processes into legally recognizable terms, such as intent, complicity, or coercion. These categories are essential for justice, but they cannot fully capture the fluidity of human psychological development in real time. This gap between legal clarity and psychological complexity is one of the enduring tensions highlighted by this case. It is not unique, but it is particularly visible here because of the age of one of the participants and the severity of the outcome. The discomfort that many people feel when encountering this case often arises from that mismatch between legal resolution and emotional ambiguity. There is also the broader question of systems of prevention. After such cases, societies often search for a single point of failure, a moment where intervention could have changed the outcome. But in cases like this, there is rarely a single point. Instead, there are distributed signals across time, shifts in communication, changes in behavior, evolving relational priorities. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between normal developmental change and patterns that indicate deeper relational restructuring. This is where hindsight can be misleading. After outcomes are known, earlier behaviors appear more significant than they may have seemed in real time. The human mind naturally reconstructs narratives in linear form, assigning meaning backwards from consequence. But prevention does not operate with that advantage. It must interpret incomplete information without knowing which direction events will ultimately take. Despite its tragedy, the case has contributed to important institutional learning. It has been referenced in discussions about adolescent vulnerability, relational influence, and the importance of multidimensional evaluation in risk assessment. It has also influenced how professionals think about the intersection between family structure, external relationships, and psychological development during adolescence. At the same time, it has also served as a reminder that not all harmful outcomes are easily preventable, even with awareness. Human relationships are complex systems, and influence can develop in ways that are not immediately visible or easily interrupted. Recognizing risk is important, but it does not guarantee the ability to fully prevent escalation in every circumstance. What remains after all analysis and interpretation is the human dimension of irreversible loss. Behind every legal classification and psychological framework are individuals whose lives were permanently altered. That reality is not reducible to explanation. It exists alongside explanation, not within it. And perhaps that is why this case continues to be revisited, not because it is unresolved in a legal sense, but because it remains emotionally and intellectually incomplete. It sits at the intersection of understanding and uncertainty, where every attempt at explanation reveals both clarity and limitation at the same time. In the end, the final reflection is not a conclusion in the traditional sense. It is an acknowledgement that some cases do not close neatly, not because the facts are unknown, but because the meaning of those facts continues to evolve as they are examined through new perspectives over time. And so the story remains not as an ending, but as a continuing reminder of how fragile the boundaries are between influence and autonomy, between development and decision, and between what is understood and what can never be fully contained within understanding. When time passes long enough after a violent case, the narrative begins to separate into two parallel realities. In one, there are official records, trial transcripts, psychological reports, sentencing decisions, and archived media coverage. In the other, there is lived memory, the emotional imprint left on families, communities, and even strangers who encounter the story only through fragments of information. These two realities do not always align, and the distance between them often grows with time rather than shrinking. The case of Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke now exists primarily in that space between documentation and memory. For legal institutions, it has been classified, processed, and concluded. For academic fields, it has been analyzed, categorized, and referenced. But for public consciousness, it remains something more unstable, a story that continues to provoke discomfort whenever it is revisited because it refuses to settle into a single moral interpretation. Part of that instability comes from the unusual structures of the case itself. It does not fit neatly into a simple narrative of offender and victim in the traditional sense that people expect from crime stories. Instead, it presents a layered configuration of influence, age difference, emotional dependency, and decision-making under psychological pressure. These elements resist reduction, and every attempt to simplify them risks flattening the complexity that makes the case so widely studied. Over time, cases like this often become symbolic. They stop being only about the individuals involved and begin to represent broader social anxieties. In this instance, the case has been used to symbolize concerns about adolescent vulnerability, the influence of older partners, and the limits of parental authority in emotionally complex situations. It has also been referenced in discussions about how quickly relational dynamics can shift when external validation becomes more powerful than internal family structure. Yet symbolism always carries a risk. When a real human tragedy becomes a symbol, there's always a possibility that the individuals involved are no longer seen as individuals. Instead, they become representations of concepts, influence, manipulation, immaturity, or culpability. This abstraction can be useful for analysis, but it can also distance the audience from a reality that these were real people whose lives were permanently altered in ways that cannot be reversed or fully comprehended from the outside. One of the most persistent lessons drawn from the case is the difficulty of recognizing escalation while it is happening. Human relationships rarely shift from normal to extreme in a single moment. Instead, they move through gradual changes in communication, emotional dependency, and perception of external authority. Each step may appear small in isolation, but over time, these steps can accumulate into a complete reorientation of decision-making frameworks. The challenge is that there is rarely a clear threshold that signals when intervention must occur. This is why the case continues to appear in training materials and discussions within psychology, criminology, and social work. It illustrates not only the importance of awareness, but also the limits of retrospective clarity. Understanding what happened after the fact is always easier than identifying it in real time. That gap between hindsight and prevention is one of the most difficult realities in any system designed to manage human behavior. There is also a quieter dimension to the aftermath that is often overlooked in analytical discussions: the long-term emotional resonance experienced by those who encountered the case indirectly. True crime narratives have a way of extending beyond their immediate context. They become part of how people think about trust, relationships, and vulnerability. Even without direct involvement, exposure to such stories can subtly influence perception of safety and social boundaries. For the families directly affected, however, there is no analytical distance. The case does not exist as theory or lesson. It exists as lived absence. No amount of time converts that absence into something neutral. It remains a fixed point in their lives, unchanged by reinterpretation or academic framing. As the years continue to pass, the case will likely be revisited again in new formats, with new technologies of analysis and new cultural perspectives. Each generation tends to reinterpret past cases through its own understanding of psychology, technology, and social structure. What remains constant, however, is the core reality that the events themselves cannot be changed, only re-examined. And so the final reflection is not a conclusion in the traditional sense. It is more of a recognition of permanence within impermanence. The details of the case are documented, the outcomes are recorded, and the analysis continues to evolve, but the underlying human consequence remains unchanged. In that sense, the story does not truly end. It settles into memory, where it continues to exist not as an active event, but as a reminder of how complex, fragile, and sometimes irreversible human relationships can become when influence, emotion, and decision converge in ways that no system can fully anticipate. When a case has been examined through legal systems, psychological frameworks, media narratives, and public discourse, what remains is not additional information, but accumulated interpretation. Each layer adds context, yet none of them fully absorbs the emotional and moral complexity of what occurred. The case of Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke exists in the space of permanent interpretive overflow, where meaning is never fully exhausted. One of the most striking aspects of long-term reflection on this case is how differently it is perceived depending on the lens through which it is viewed. From a legal perspective, it is a case of criminal responsibility divided by age and role. From a psychological perspective, it is an example of influence, developmental vulnerability, and relational escalation. From a sociological perspective, it is a study in family structure, authority conflict, and external social bonding. Yet none of these perspectives alone can fully contain the emotional weight of the story. This fragmentation of understanding is not a weakness of analysis. It is a reflection of how human behavior itself resists singular explanation. People do not act from one cause, nor do they exist within one interpretive framework. They are shaped by overlapping environments, shifting emotions, and evolving perceptions of reality. In this case, those overlapping forces align in a way that produced irreversible consequences. Over time, professionals who study similar cases often emphasize the importance of early relational mapping, not in the sense of predicting outcomes with certainty, but in recognizing how influence can accumulate gradually within private emotional spaces. Relationships that appear externally ordinary can contain internal dynamics that are not immediately visible. This gap between appearance and internal reality is one of the most persistent challenges in prevention-based systems. However, even with greater awareness, there is no absolute method to detect all forms of relational escalation in real time. Human behavior does not follow linear patterns that can be universally decoded. It shifts depending on context, emotional state, and social environment. This unpredictability means that even well-informed observers can miss critical changes until they have already developed into something irreversible. The aftermath of the case also continues to highlight the difference between explanation and resolution. Explanation seeks to understand how something happened. Resolution implies that understanding leads to closure. In reality, these two outcomes are not always connected. A case can be fully explained in factual terms while still remaining emotionally unresolved for those who engage with it. This is particularly evident in cases involving family violence, where the boundary between private emotional systems and external social systems becomes blurred. Families operate as internal emotional ecosystems, and when those systems are disrupted, the effects are not easily contained within external frameworks like law or policy. The ripple effects extend into memory, identity, and long-term perception of safety. In the broader cultural context, this case continues to serve as a reference point for discussions about how quickly emotional relationships can reshape moral boundaries. It is often cited not because it is unique in its structure, but because it makes visible processes that are usually hidden. The gradual shift from emotional attachment to distorted justification is a phenomenon that can occur in many contexts, but is rarely observed with such clarity in documented form. There is also an important lesson embedded in the long-term public response to the case. Over time, initial reactions of shock and moral certainty often evolve into more nuanced discussions about complexity and influence. This shift reflects a broader pattern in how societies process difficult cases. Immediate emotional responses gradually give way to analytical reflection, which then opens space for ambiguity and uncertainty. Yet, even with increased understanding, there is a limit to how fully such a case can be integrated into a coherent narrative. Some elements remain inherently resistant to simplification. The emotional reality of loss, the complexity of adolescent development, and the dynamics of interpersonal influence cannot be fully translated into structured explanation without losing essential depth. This is why the case continues to be revisited across different formats and generations. Each retelling is not just repetition, but reinterpretation. New contexts bring new questions, and new questions bring new angles of understanding. However, the core reality of what happened does not change, even as the interpretation of it continues to evolve. Ultimately, the lasting significance of the case lies not in any single conclusion, but in the accumulation of questions it leaves behind. Questions about how influence operates in private relationships. Questions about how responsibility is assigned when development is incomplete. Questions about how systems respond when human behavior does not fit neatly into predefined categories. These questions do not have final answers, and perhaps they are not meant to. Instead, they function as ongoing points of reflection, shaping how future cases are understood and how similar situations are approached. And so, in the end, What remains is not closure in the traditional sense, but continuity of thought. The case becomes part of a larger conversation about human behavior, one that does not end with a verdict or a report, but continues wherever people try to understand how ordinary emotional connections can, under certain conditions, evolve into something far more tragic and irreversible. When a case reaches this level of retelling, something subtle but important happens. The story stops belonging only to history and begins to exist as a kind of collective memory. It is no longer anchored solely in a specific time, place, or legal outcome. Instead, it becomes part of how people think about vulnerability, influence, responsibility, and the fragile structure of trust within human relationships. The case of Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke has entered that space, where its significance is no longer limited to what was done, but extends into how it continues to be interpreted. One of the most enduring aspects of this case is the way it resists emotional finality. Even when every factual element is known, even when every legal decision has been made, and every timeline reconstructed, there remains an emotional dissonance that cannot be fully resolved. That dissonance arises because the case sits at the intersection of developmental psychology, relational influence, and irreversible consequence. These domains do not align neatly, and their overlap creates tension that persists long after the narrative ends. In examining this case over time, it becomes clear that human understanding operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There's a factual level, where events are recorded and verified. There is the analytical level, where behavior is interpreted through psychological and social frameworks. And there's the emotional level, where individuals respond not to structure or explanation, but to the raw reality of loss, confusion, and moral discomfort. These layers do not merge into a single unified conclusion. Instead, they coexist, sometimes in contradiction. The emotional dimension of this case is particularly persistent because it involves not only violence, but also the disruption of foundational assumptions about family, adolescence, and influence. Families are generally understood as protective systems, structured around care, guidance, and boundaries. When those assumptions are violated, the psychological impact extends beyond the immediate event. It affects how people perceive the stability of relationships in general. At the same time, adolescence represents a developmental stage defined by transition. Identity formation during this period is fluid, and external relationships can become highly influential. This does not inherently lead to harmful outcomes, but it does create conditions where emotional intensity can override long-term reasoning if reinforced in certain ways. The case illustrates how these developmental conditions can intersect with relational dynamics in ways that are difficult to detect in real time. From a systems perspective, one of the most important lessons that continues to emerge from this case is the limitation of retrospective clarity. After outcomes are known, it is always easier to reconstruct sequences of influence and identify turning points. However, prevention does not have the advantage of hindsight. It must operate in conditions of uncertainty, where signals are incomplete and meanings are not yet fully formed. This gap between understanding after the fact and recognition in the moment remains one of the central challenges in social and psychological intervention. Another enduring aspect of the case is the way it has been absorbed into educational and professional discourse. It is frequently referenced not as an isolated anomaly, but as an example of broader principles related to influence, vulnerability, and relational escalation. In these contexts, the case is not treated as a singular story, but as a structured illustration of how complex human dynamics can evolve under specific conditions. However, even within these structured discussions, there is always an acknowledgement that no framework can fully contain the emotional reality of what occurred. Over time, public engagement with the case has also shifted. Initial reactions were dominated by shock and attempts to assign clear moral categories. With distance, those reactions have often softened into more reflective interpretations. This does not reduce the seriousness of what happened, but it changes the way it is processed. Instead of seeking simple explanations, there is a greater willingness to accept complexity, ambiguity, and the limits of understanding. Yet, even this shift toward reflection does not produce closure in the emotional sense. The reason is that cases involving deep relational distortion and irreversible harm do not resolve cleanly within human perception. They remain open at the level of meaning, even when they are closed at the level of law. This distinction between legal closure and emotional continuation is one of the most important aspects of long-term case analysis. Ultimately, what remains after all layers of interpretation have been applied is not a final answer, but a sustained awareness of fragility. Fragility in relationships, fragility in perception, and fragility in the systems that are meant to interpret and respond to human behavior. The case continues to exist not because it is unresolved, but because it continues to reveal how many dimensions are involved in understanding even a single sequence of human actions. And so, the final reflection is not an ending in the traditional sense. It is a recognition that some narratives do not conclude with resolution, but with continued presence and thought. They remain as reference points, not because they explain everything, but because they remind us how much cannot be fully explained. Even when every fact is known and every outcome is recorded,